Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. This afternoon, Bhante Ji has asked me to speak on the Mahā-Cattārīsaka Sutta from the Majjhima Nikāya. This is Sutta number 117, in the middle-length Discourses of the Buddha, which Bhikkhu Bodhi has translated the title as the Great 40. So although this retreat is a metta retreat, this sutta does not particularly have much to do with metta. So accordingly, this talk will not have much to do with metta. This is a slight departure from theme. So for those of you who are not familiar with this format, what I'll do is I'll read a few lines from the sutta and then explain it or describe it. And then I'll read a few more lines and describe that and so on through the end of the sutta. So the sutta begins. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. So as many of you know, this is a place where the Buddha spent much of his life and gave many of his discourses. There he addressed the bhikkhus thus, "Bhikkhus, Venerable Sir," they replied. The Blessed One said this, "Bhikkhus, I shall teach you noble right concentration with its supports and its requisites. Listen and attend closely to what I shall say." "Yes, Venerable Sir," the bhikkhus replied. The Blessed One said this, "What, bhikkhus, is noble right concentration with its supports and its requisites? That is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, and right mindfulness." So this is this laying out the basic format of this sutta, and that the sutta will be focused around the Noble Eightfold Path. So this may be a very familiar topic to many people, but it's still worth delving into and refreshing and getting alternate perspectives on, as this is, in many ways, it's the heart of the Buddha's teaching. It contains the essence of the path, and thus it's always worth getting a new perspective on it, or taking another look at it, or even just reminding ourselves of it, due to the primacy of its importance in understanding what the Buddha taught and putting it into application in our lives. So, the Buddha goes on. Unification of mind equipped with these 7 factors is called noble right concentration with its supports and its requisites. Therein, bhikkhus, right view comes first. So this is an extremely important statement, and this is the refrain or the chorus line of the sutta that the Buddha keeps coming back to. So right view comes first. So this is pointing to something critical in practice, in that if we're doing the practice from a basis of misunderstanding or misapprehension, if we're doing it for the wrong reasons, if we're doing it with an inaccurate belief structure in place, then we actually won't really get that much benefit from the practice. Even if we're doing all the steps and we think we're practicing our concentration or doing our metta or doing our investigation or whatever it is we're trying to do, even if we think we're doing everything correctly, if our fundamental perspective on the universe is flawed, then we're not going to attain enlightenment, and we're not going to make much progress along the path. So fundamentally, what it comes down to is that we must always start with right view. And also, not only do we start with right view, but the entire practice can be said to be about the development of right view, the establishment of right view, the fulfillment and perfection of right view. So you might just stop and look at right view for a moment. So the Pali here for right view is Samma Ditti. So Samma means proper or appropriate, complete, accurate. So it does mean right in a relatively plain way of translating it, but it has this broader perspective of appropriate or proper or accurate or true. And ditti literally means view, in the sense of what is seen and what we see. So the root here, dis, means literally to see, like you see with your eyes. So a ditti is our perspective. It's our viewpoint. It's the way that we see the world. And this is mostly metaphorical in that what's really being spoken about here is our belief system. The way that we think about the world. And even deeper than the layer of thought, this often reflects our subconscious assumptions about the universe, our subconscious tendency to slot things into certain categories, or to ignore certain sensory input, or to interpret sensory input in certain ways. So the Samma Ditti is much deeper than just some clearly verbalized belief. I believe X, Y, Z. Often it's functioning on a much more subtle subconscious layer of just our automatic assumptions, our automatic tendency to believe things are a certain way, or to associate certain things in certain ways. So this is something which, again, it's something which can take an enormous amount of ongoing effort to really establish right view, simply because much of this is functioning on a layer beneath what we normally believe that we have direct control over. So it's fairly easy to see that we have direct control over our conscious thought processes to some extent. We can decide, I am now going to think about ferns, and we can think about ferns. Or I am going to think about cushions, and we think about cushions, and so on. So we have a clear amount of control in this superficial way. But getting some handle on these underlying processes of the mind can require an extraordinary degree of focus, an extraordinary degree of concentration of mind. And it also requires clearing away a lot of the obstructive noise in the mind, a lot of the things that fog our ability to clearly see what's going on. So one example that many people are probably familiar with, that we talk about in meditation practice, are the 5 hindrances. So kama chanda, sensual desire, vyapada, aversion, tina middha, drowsiness or torpor, udhacha kucha, so restlessness and remorse, and vicikiccha, a skeptical doubt. These are things which cloud the mind, which fog the mind, which prevent us from seeing clearly what's going on. So these are all things which, as well as being obstacles to concentration practice, they're obstacles to the development of right view, because they prevent us from seeing clearly what's going on within our own mind. And thus they prevent us from seeing clearly our own habitual belief processes, which are operating on a subconscious level. So the work that we do in concentration practice, or the work that we do in any development of Buddhist meditation, as well as being beneficial towards samadhi, it also helps to clear the ground to some extent so that we can start to develop right view. But it's not enough simply to remove the hindrances and develop samadhi. Because even though that's enormously beneficial and very useful, if we don't have an intellectual understanding of the direction in which the Buddha wishes us to focus our mind, if we don't have an intellectual understanding of the universe as seen through the eyes of an enlightened being, then it's next to impossible to be able to set ourselves in that direction. So we do need to start as well with establishing a strong basis of intellectual right view. So this means doing things like reading the suttas, reading the discourses of the Buddha, even if at first glance it doesn't seem to make very much sense, or it's really repetitive, or it's boring, or we don't like it, or whatever our initial aversions are. We just keep coming back to the words of the Buddha, optimally spending some time with the suttas every day. And initially it might seem like that's not benefiting us very much, but over a period of time, as we start to develop a stockpile of intellectual understanding of the Buddha's teachings, then that starts to seep in. That starts to get below the layer of mere conscious thought, and it starts to influence this subconscious layer of perception, the subconscious tendencies that we have, these subconscious belief structures that we've built up. So we can kind of come at it then from two directions here with the development of right view. We come at it from this more subtle way of developing concentration, of clearing the mind of the hindrances, of developing clarity and clear understanding. And we also come at it from this intellectual perspective of studying the teachings, of listening to Dhamma talks, of exposing ourselves to the suttas and thinking about it, like really considering what the Buddha taught, not merely in sort of like a, oh yeah, I know that, I understand that, but actually stopping and thinking, what did the Buddha mean when he said X, Y, Z? How does that change the way that we see the world? How does that change the way that we act? How does that change the way that we speak? How does that change the way that we think? So taking it one step further, instead of just taking it as like, okay, I can recite the 7 factors of enlightenment, I can recite the 8 steps of the Noble Eightfold Path, I can recite this or I can recite that, and that's all well and good. But what we really need to do is actually consider deeply, how does this change the way that we see the world? How does this change the way that we interact with the world? How does this change the way that we interact with other people? And most fundamentally, how does this change the way that we deal with our own mind? Because ultimately, this all comes through our own mind. And this is all about the development of our own mind. So again, this all comes back to developing right view. Returning to the sutta, the Buddha goes on. And how does right view come first? One understands wrong view as wrong view, and right view as right view. This is one's right view. And what, bhikkhus, is wrong view? So, and next the Buddha gives an example of pretty abject wrong view, a false belief. There is nothing given, nothing offered, nothing sacrificed, no fruit or result of good and bad actions, no this world, no other world, no mother, no father, no beings who are reborn spontaneously, no good and virtuous contemplatives and Brahmins in the world who have realized for themselves by direct knowledge and declare this world and the other world. This is wrong view. So again, this is a pretty blatant example. So this is, at its heart, it's a refutation of karma. It's a refutation of causality. This is the belief that your actions don't matter, that you can do whatever you want, that nothing you do has any effect. And that's a relatively extreme standpoint. Usually people have a more mild form of this, where they acknowledge the really obvious forms of cause and effect. Like usually people will, in fact, acknowledge that when you throw a ball up in the air, it's going to fall back down. Usually people will acknowledge the most blatant examples of causality. Where they get a bit more hesitant is around this longer-term perspective of when you do bad things, inevitably you will get bad results. When you do good things, inevitably you will get good results. This is where people tend to shy back, like people who hold this kind of wrong view. This is where they tend to hesitate or reject it outright. But this is something which the Buddha was very clear. He's like, every single action you take does have a concordant result. So there is such a thing as generosity. There is giving something that does have a clear effect. There is such a thing as the results of good and bad actions. And also he did say that there is both this world that we experience and also other worlds. So other modes of life. We have this human world that we experience, but there are also worlds of devas and deities of various kinds. And there are worlds of animals that we can perceive, and also there are worlds of ghosts and spirits and demons and all kinds of less pleasant modes of being. So the Buddha was very clear in that there is this enormous spectrum of different worlds, an enormous spectrum of different ways of being a living being. And that what choices we make determine where we wind up in this whole spectrum of existence. But also emphasizing that every mode of being within this is itself transitory. It is temporary. So even the most sublime deities with the most exceptionally happy lives eventually die and are reborn elsewhere. And again, even the most miserable, terribly painful and depressing states of existence are also temporary. And beings born in those states will eventually die and be reborn somewhere else, hopefully a happier state of being. And again, one of the major elements of this intellectual right view is this point about that there are practitioners, spiritual practitioners, who can, by means of their own efforts through meditation and understanding and developing wisdom and discernment, are able to clearly see these processes, who can clearly see causality, who can clearly see kamma in action, who can clearly see that there are multiple worlds and that beings can be reborn both in very happy states of existence and also in very miserable states of existence, and the whole spectrum in between. So it's this recognition fundamentally of causality, but also of the ability to develop a direct experiential perception of causality in action. So this is intellectual right view as it is laid out in this sutta. And of course, right view is explained in many different ways, in many different suttas. So this is by no means the only way of understanding right view, but it's the one that the Buddha chose to emphasize in this particular sutta. So moving on with the sutta here. And what, bhikkhus, is right view? Right view, I say, is twofold. There is right view that is affected by taints, partaking of merit, ripening on the side of attachment. And there is right view that is noble, taintless, supramundane, a factor of the path. So the distinction he's making here is that there's a kind of basic understanding of the way things work, like understanding cause and effect in a basic way, just the general understanding of when I'm kind and generous and loving and caring and compassionate and so on, then I will experience happiness. And when I'm mean and miserable and so on, and cruel and unkind and selfish, then I will experience unhappiness. That's kind of the basic understanding which does not free one from this whole cycle of misery, which does not lead to enlightenment. That's a basic form of right view which allows one to behave in a way that generates the results you want. So it's an understanding which means if you decide, I want to be happy and prosperous and so on, then you will naturally choose to do good things based on this basic mundane right view. Or if for some reason you decide you want to be miserable and unhappy, then you can go around being selfish and mean and angry and whatever you like. But it's just this understanding in the most mundane sense. But what the Buddha is setting that opposite to is the transcendent right view. The right view which allows us to see through this whole process as being inherently unsatisfying. Basically, no matter how many times we get reborn in wonderfully happy states of being as devas or as rich celebrities or whatever we think we want, it will not ultimately satisfy us. No matter how many times we get it, no matter how long it lasts, ultimately it will never be 100% satisfying. So this is simply a recognition that the game is not worth playing. So mundane right view is understanding the rules of the game. Transcendent right view is the recognition that the game is not worth playing. That ultimately the best thing to do is to quit, to get out of the game, because no matter how much time we spend playing it, it will not satisfy us. We'll just keep going through the same cycles over and over and over and over again, just as we have been all along. And I think most of us, at some point, start to recognize just how incredibly exhausting, how incredibly depressing that really is. That we've been doing this over and over and over and over again, and we still haven't broken through. We still keep walking into the same trap again and again and again. So transcendent right view is this recognition that we actually have a choice in the matter. We can actually choose not to get stuck in this trap. We can actually choose to free ourselves from this cycle permanently. As much as anything can be said to be permanent, this liberation of mind, this deliverance of mind that the Buddha speaks about, is one thing that cannot be turned back, that cannot be reversed. So this is the one thing which we can truly count on. But it should be, of course, clarified that the Buddha never said this is easy. He never said it's quick. It does take a lot of time and effort. But at some point we recognize that there's really nothing else that's worth doing. We can spend as much time in the playground as we like, but at some point we have to grow up and realize that that's really not the place we want to be. And we've been there for so long anyway. So moving on with this sutta. And what bhikkhus is right view that is affected by the taints, partaking of merit, ripening on the side of attachment? There is what is given and what is offered and what is sacrificed. There is fruit and result of good and bad actions. There is this world and the other world. There is mother and father. There are beings who are reborn spontaneously. There are in the world good and virtuous contemplatives and Brahmins who have realized for themselves by direct knowledge and declare this world and the other world. This is right view affected by taints, partaking of merit, ripening on the side of attachment. So again, this is that basic intellectual right view that I was discussing earlier. And the Buddha describes it as affected by taints, so affected by the asavas. So this means that it is still fundamentally bound up in desire for sensuality. It is still fundamentally bound up in desire for existence of one kind or another. It is still fundamentally bound up with wrong understanding, with delusion, with ignorance, with a false perspective on the way things work. And partaking of merit is simply saying that this is within the realm of good and bad actions. So it's simply playing that same game of causality that we've been playing all along. And ripening on the side of attachment. What the Buddha is pointing to here is that this is not something which frees us from clinging and desire, but rather it's something which actually tends to simply strengthen that. So we do good things, and we're kind to our neighbors, and we give gifts to our friends, and we tell the truth, and we do all these wonderful, meritorious things that we can do with our lives. And we're doing it with the thought of, by doing all these good things, then I'm going to be happy and beautiful and joyful and so on. What that is based on is the desire for happiness, the desire for joy, the attachment to pleasure. That's what it's based on. So even though we're doing good things from a basis of selfishness. So it is, as the Buddha says here, it's ripening on the side of attachment. It is simply strengthening our attachment to getting things the way we want. The attachment to getting things my way. Like, I want it like this. So I'm going to be a good person, so I can get things just the way I want them. This is simply a form of attachment. I mean, it's certainly better than being mean and nasty and cruel and vicious and so on. It's a lot better. But it is still within the realm of attachment. It is still focused on attachment to sensuality, attachment to happiness, attachment to pleasant experiences, attachment to having things the way we want. And that attachment is never going to free us from suffering. That attachment is never going to satisfy us. In fact, it's simply setting ourselves up for dissatisfaction when inevitably something doesn't go our way. I'm sure we've all had the experience of not getting our way. And that experience will just keep on happening. Doesn't stop. It'll stop for a little while. But ultimately, at some point, something's not going to go our way. And that's just the way the game of samsara works. Sometimes you get what you want, and sometimes you don't. There's not much we can do about it except to develop the transcendent right view that allows us to step out of the game. That allows us to take a step back and say, I'm not going to play this constant yo-yo back and forth that I've been playing all along. I'm going to aim for unshakable peace. I'm going to aim for a peace of mind which is not dependent upon things I can't control. Because that's the only true basis of happiness that we can have, is a happiness which is not dependent upon conditions being a particular way. That's our only real hope, which is why we do this practice, because it's pointing in that direction. So the Buddha continues, and what, bhikkhus, is right view that is noble, taintless, supramundane, a factor of the path. The wisdom, the faculty of wisdom, the power of wisdom, the investigation of states, enlightenment factor, the path factor of right view in one whose mind is noble, whose mind is taintless, who possesses the noble path and is developing the noble path. This is right view that is noble, taintless, supramundane, a factor of the path. So, unfortunately, this may be a bit less clear than one would particularly hope for. Because effectively what the Buddha is saying here is that, one, we need to develop wisdom. We need to develop discernment. We need to develop the ability to clearly see things as they are. So this is something which, again, it's dependent upon developing strength of mind, which concentration, samadhi practice is something which directly benefits or contributes towards. And again, it's something which this whole development of right view leads in the direction of. But it is also fundamentally dependent upon this element of nibbida. So nibbida is a word that's often translated as disenchantment. And nibbida and its close relative or correlate, viraga, dispassion. So nibbida, disenchantment, is, as I was speaking about earlier, it's this loss of enchantment with samsara. It's this recognition of just how tawdry and pointless the game of samsara really is. It's this recognition that all we're doing is just chasing our tails over and over and over and over again for eons and eons and eons. It's this recognition of how incredibly pointless that is. So that's nibbida, that's disenchantment.